Well, welcome back. I'm here today with Eric Jones, our wonderful Estraios violist. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm good. How are you, Chris?
I'm great. It's so nice to get to sit down and talk with you.
It is. Yeah, same here.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to play the viola in the first place?
Yeah, I started actually on violin. I don't really remember this, but apparently I did Suzuki violin from age 2 to 3.
Oh, wow.
Until we moved to a place where there were no violin teachers, and then I picked it back up again in 5th grade in Oklahoma. And then I played violin, but I liked the sound of the viola a little better because it's lower, and I always enjoyed the harmony parts a little bit more than the melody parts. So I switched in 6th grade to studying viola, and so it's been viola, I guess, ever since.
Ever since? Oh, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
And you say ever since. You've gone on, you have multiple degrees.
Yeah, I have a bachelor's and master's in viola performance, and I have a master's in ethnomusicology as well. So, yeah.
So how long does it take to go through those programs?
Usually, the average, like for a master's, is I guess maybe 2 years. I was doing 2 sometimes at the same time, so it was, I don't remember exactly, may have been 3 or 4 or something like that to finish those 2, but some of it I did concurrently.
And for people who might know what ethnomusicology encompasses, would you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the easiest way, the most basic way that I usually explain it is it's basically studying music of different cultures somewhere in the world. Traditionally this used to be, some far off culture in their music, but that can mean a music culture that is in the same place that you live, but all musics have their own kind of musical and cultural elements. And so it's basically studying the relationship between music and culture in a particular context.
And were the particular contexts that you studied?
Yeah, I did. So my main area is Latin American music. So I lived in Bolivia for several years, and I was studying it was basically music that was being created in the cities. There was huge rural to urban migration in the 80s and 90s, and actually starting in the 70s even, in Latin America, especially in the Andes. And so there were more indigenous traditional forms of music that were brought along with a lot of the people who were migrating to the cities, and a kind of hybrid music developed that incorporated that more traditional indigenous style of music with more sort of popular musics, European music, rock music in the cities, other types of Latin American folk music. So I was kind of studying how that process happened in Bolivia in South America.
Very cool. And what inspired you to go off on this particular course of study in the first place? I mean, you'd been playing the viola for most of your life. And
yeah, I also, most of my life, have been really interested and fascinated by, at first it was just maps, and then geography, and especially things like cultural geography, and the relationship between music of a particular place and that place and the people who live in that place. So ethnomusicology was a way for me to kind of pull in both of those 2 interests into one field.
Very cool. Are there any particular times that you remember, a concert that you performed in, or something that you listened to when you were studying, that was just particularly meaningful to you or moving in some way that stands out in your memory?
Yeah, several performances actually in South America when I've been there. I was I played in, it was basically it was for a Baroque music festival that happens in Bolivia every 2 years in the eastern parts. So these are very small towns in tropical lowlands in eastern Bolivia where there were Jesuit missions in the 1700s, and this is where they actually had orchestras of native people playing. And so there's a Baroque music festival that in a lot of these towns in eastern Bolivia where Baroque music from Europe and also Baroque music that was written in Bolivia is played. And so I got to go on a tour of several of these little mission towns in Chiquitania in eastern Bolivia. And we had an Italian violinist come, Francesco Senesi, who played the Four Seasons with us, Vivaldi Four Seasons, which was phenomenal. But where we played in the church, the restored mission churches that are still used as churches usually right at the main plaza in these little towns. And these aren't like concert halls. These are sort of, the large wooden doors are open. You can hear, birds outside, babies crying, but we were playing, and this was, I think this was in Concepcion, but this is a town, and we were playing, and you could see the doors were really, really tall. So even from up at the front where we were playing, you could see out, and there were these lights, and there was sort of mist out there. And there's a movement in the Four Seasons where the violas play what is supposed to be a dog sort of barking languidly in the heat. And as we were playing that movement, a dog just sort of wandered in from the plaza and walked up the middle of the aisle and just sort of watched us for a while, and then after a minute or so moseyed off to the side. But it was just a really pretty incredible moment. Something that doesn't usually happen in concerts, in the US, in a concert hall or a symphony hall. Yeah. So it was really nice to play music in a completely different cultural and social context like that for me.
Sounds magical.
Yeah, it was. It was really nice. Yeah.
You mentioned things that happen that are unexpected. Are there any particular memories you have from gigging, or where something unexpected happened during a concert? People love the gossip.
That's
still
true.
Some tea. So.
There have been, I have heard other people's stories, and some people have like fantastic stories about. I do have some humorous stories, but once I was playing in an orchestra when we were playing The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And the beginning of that starts out fairly quiet, and then the bassoons play some rhythmic low notes, and this was right after intermission, and we all came back out on stage, the audience was back, the lights went down, and we were tuning, and some of us, I noticed other people were hearing it. There was some kind of strange sort of rumbling noise. We thought maybe we heard from the audience, we couldn't tell. Anyway, right after that, the conductor came out, applause, so, I didn't think anything of it, and then we started right away. Well, it's pretty soft at the beginning, and once we started, you could realize it was somebody snoring out there. It was a guy... And to top it off, it was happening rhythmically. So this is, I think the piece starts in, I think it's a 3/8, and the bassoons are boom, and then we heard, and then boom, 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 and it continued. Once people realized, we could hear it, like. People were biting their tongues. People's faces were turning red in the orchestra. Tears started to come out because, you can't just bust out laughing. So we were playing, and then once things got going, things get louder, and then when we came to a rest again, we didn't hear it, so he apparently woke up. But that was really entertaining. That was kind of fun. And let's see. I played in one concert where the conductor stopped in the middle of a movement and turned around and yelled at a newspaper photographer who had taken a flash photo right in the middle of the movement, and then turned right, I think it was at a rest maybe, and then continued right away again. So it was a little, that had never happened, and it's never happened since either. And then we play, as string players, we play a lot of sometimes wedding gigs. So there was one that I played where the bride fainted twice, and we were a little bit shook, but then I think it was the aunt who was responsible for kind of she was like, oh, she's a fainter, don't worry, she's fine. She does this all the time. And she was dancing at the reception after. And
wow.
So, but yeah, interesting and humorous things can happen in concerts. When the tension is high, sometimes, that's the moment when things can go haywire occasionally. So.
Can erupt in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it makes it entertaining.
For sure. You mentioned that you started playing the violin when you were very small. You've mostly played the viola. Are there other instruments that you've played?
Yeah, I took piano lessons when I was a kid, I think up until 10, 11, or 12. So I can play piano now. I'm not a pianist by any means, but I know enough to be able to play things and figure things out. And I also I did a lot of singing when I was younger. That more when I was before my voice changed, so like children's choirs and things like that. And I still play violin too. I probably consider myself more a violist, but I play violin sometimes as well. So yeah, and in terms of instruments that I've officially studied, I think that's probably just those. Yeah.
If you could learn any instrument, what, besides obviously the ones that you've talked about, or if you could increase your expertise level in one, what might you choose?
I would choose the drums, the drum set.
Oh, why the drums?
I love rhythm. I always wanted to. I wanted to when I went from 5th grade to 6th grade, I wanted to be in orchestra and band so I could play. Actually, at that time it was either saxophone or drums. Actually, I would love to play tenor sax too, jazz tenor saxophone. But I always am somebody who sort of like drums along with things, even with my hands. I know how drum set is played. I don't play it, or I've never studied it or taken lessons, but that definitely is one that I would, the next instrument I would like to learn.
If you hadn't been a musician, what do you think you might have gone into?
Well, I was thinking about that. When I was little, I wanted to be a truck driver because I loved to see semis going by on the road.
Optimus Prime.
Yeah, probably. That's a very good question. Maybe a national park or forest ranger, something that has to do with being outdoors. I love the outdoors. Something related to, I don't know that I would like to be a farmer per se, but some kind of occupation that's outdoors, outside. Also, a homicide detective, because I always have loved mysteries and crime stuff and reading noir crime novels and things like that. So I don't know that I would necessarily be a good one, but in my mind it seems like an interesting career and interesting thing to do. So
fascinating. So what does a week in the life of a working violist look like?
Well, for me, a typical week is, there is not really a typical week other than the week encompasses teaching private violin and viola lessons during the day. Usually if it's during weekdays, during school days. So I go to some different schools and give lessons to students. And then in the evenings, depending on what week it is and what month, what time of year, I may have usually some rehearsals for gigs, orchestra gigs that we would have concerts for on the weekend. So that's not always every week. That's usually like 2 weeks out of the month maybe. But it's very, there's a lot of variety because there are, I will get asked to play, a wedding string quartet on a weekend, or something in a church gig, or I played an interesting sort of disco gig at the Fort Worth Zoo like a month or two ago, which I had never,
Viola disco?
Disco music. It was, sorry, let me be a little clear.
I'm just trying
The music that we played was disco music, but it was a full sort of like big bands, basically, almost like horn section, drums, electric bass, guitars, keyboards, percussion, and a string section. And so a lot of those old, disco heads have really cool string parts, arpeggiated, really rapid scales, lots of fun, things like doing glissandi or jumping around, lots of quick dynamic changes. So it was fun. It was a fundraiser for the zoo, so it wasn't, the animals weren't dancing with us there, unfortunately. But
I'm disappointed now. I wanted to see the orangutan doing the YMCA.
Exactly, yeah, or serving drinks, but but walking in, you could sort of hear him. It was in a different part, but there's a lot of variety in not only in music but in places where you play, and it's really interesting. So there's some is sort of more normal, like the teaching during the week happens every day during the week, and then the freelance stuff is the nice variety, and a lot, it's different ensembles too. So it may be an orchestra, it may be like with a big band thing, it might be a string quartet, a duo, or, a quartet with flutes, bassoon, violin, and viola, anything really. So that's part of why I enjoy it a lot too.
That's cool. For the teaching part, that consistent part of it, how many students do you have in a week? It
depends. That can depend on the semester and stuff. It's usually between like 30 to 40. When they're in the schools, the lessons are usually not an hour long, just because they happen sometimes one person or two people during a class period. So that doesn't mean necessarily 30 or 40 straight hours of teaching. So some kids will have 30 minutes, some 45. And then I have also a few on the weekends that are hour lessons, that's kind of a little bit more standard.
What are some misconceptions that people might have about the viola or your life as a working musician?
Well, about the viola is sort of known as like the butt of all of the jokes in the orchestra. So the viola is the punchline of all the bad jokes, like what is it? What's the difference between a viola and a trampoline?
What?
With a trampoline, you take your shoes off before you jump on it, or just like over the top jokes.
Just mean.
But the sort of, this really isn't the case so much anymore. It was a little more when I was younger, I think, and like high school. But like the viola was thought of as sort of inferior to the violin in terms of its role in orchestral playing. And it is true that sometimes the viola parts are not as virtuosic as the first violin parts. We don't get the melody quite as often, but they are in their own way difficult, and I think the viola is also becoming more recognized as an equal in terms of voicing, like in chamber music and roles in the orchestra as well. I remember that attitude, not necessarily among orchestral musicians, but amongst musicians who may not have been familiar with stringed instruments. That was sort of something that somehow everyone kind of knew, but it wasn't necessarily actually true. So I don't notice that quite as much anymore, but yeah. I don't know the other, this isn't really a misconception, but viola sometimes, people who don't know the difference between a violin and viola will, I have heard myself explain it to people many, many times that the viola is like a larger violin, which in one sense it is because it has a similar shape and it's played in the same way, but in another sense that's sort of, I guess, a reductionist view because it has one lower string. It doesn't have the same, three of the strings are the same as violin. And physically there are some differences. It's held in the same way, but the function of the viola in the orchestra is different than the violin. It works in a different way musically when it's in ensembles.
So really the violin's just a high-pitched viola.
That's another way of looking at it, which some violists subscribe to. So, yep.
Would you mention briefly the way that viola music is written?
Oh yeah, so we have a clef that is, we call it alto clef. So it's a 5-line staff, just like a flute would play from, or a cello would play from, a bass clef. But the clef, basically it has there are 2 loops like that. Sometimes it's called a C clef, and the middle line in the staff then for us is middle C on the piano. So for us that's our 3rd finger in first position on the G string, is the middle note. If you were playing in treble clef, that middle line would be a B, a major 7th above middle C. And if you're playing bass clef, that middle line would be a D below middle C. So it's a range kind of in between bass clef and treble clef, spanning a little bit of each one. And then we also, when our notes get higher, we also sometimes play in treble clef too, just so that we're not reading, notes that have like 5 ledger lines. Makes it a little bit easier to read. But yeah, usually those are the 2 clefs that we use.
One more reason violas are special.
That's right, exactly.